Hello YouTube. Ancient Tamriel is full of fascinating stories, from the story of the first pirate king, Red Bremen, to the story of Lyricius, the first dragon rider. Now, today we're talking about another story set in Ancient Tamriel, the story of the sea elf necromancer Uldor, who became so insane that likely even Sheogorath would say, "Oh, pump the brakes." So, sit back, as today we're talking about one of the most vile necromancers of Ancient Tamriel. So, Uldor the Necromancer. He was a sea elf or marmer, governor and necromancer who lived somewhere during either the late Merethic era or the early First era, at a time when Elsewhere was not in any way united and was fractured into the 16 Khajiit kingdoms that we talked about before on this channel. Link in the description if you want to know more about this period of Khajiit history. But what's important to know is that at this time the Khajiit were not unified, and that Khajiit kingdoms of the continent mostly just concerned themselves with the mainland. And that brings us to this little island, Karthi's Roost. It's one of the many islands south of Tamriel, and just like many of the other islands to the south, this island had been occupied by the Marmer or Sea Elves for long periods of its history. As the Sea Elves, who come from the southern continent of Piandene, have used their outposts on these small islands to facilitate their pirate or privateer fleets that they used to raid the trade routes of southern Tamriel, particularly those belonging to their ancient enemies, the High Elves, or the Altmer of Somerset. Now, as I said, Karthi's Roost during its history has often been occupied by the Sea Elves, and while the island is mostly inhabited by Khajiit, who use the island's rich soil for moon sugar plantations, over the course of its history they have often been ruled over by the Sea Elves, and somewhere during the late Merethic or early First era, the Sea Elf governor to the island was one of their mages, an elf named Uldor. Now, Uldor wasn't a particularly pleasant ruler for the island. It's said that he ruled with an iron fist and that he heavily exploited the local Khajiit and their plantations. And while that is bad enough on its own, he also dabbled heavily in necromancy, and was quite an inventive necromancer at that, because he discovered how to split his spirit and body from each other without killing off his body, being able to return whenever he wanted. But more importantly, this spirit-body split allowed him to possess both corpses and the living. It's likely that specifically his ability to possess the living beings was feared during this time, as we can see during the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, that with his separate spirit he was even able to possess very accomplished mages and make them do exactly as he wanted. Now, whether or not it was because of this power or just because he was already a little insane to begin with, he started to go completely off his rocker at some point, as it seems that he had those who did not obey him simply killed, only to then quote-unquote wear their corpses like clothes. He started to, in his own words, really enjoy wearing other people's bodies, and as such he amassed quite a collection at the Khajiit temple from which he ruled. That's disgusting. In fact, when Nordic raiders from Windhelm, who had sailed all along Tamriel's coast to plunder everywhere, arrived on the island, Uldor simply killed all of them, only to then add their bodies to his quote-unquote wardrobe. This guy was completely off his rocker, calling his victims his outfits and making categories on how fresh the flesh was and categorizing them on when he wanted to wear the corpses, specifically keeping them for seasons, so wearing some of them in autumn and some of them in summer, winter and spring. Now, this complete insanity fortunately did not go unnoticed by his Marmer subordinates, and the Marmer who occupied the island banded together with the local Khajiit to depose the Mad Necromancer. The Khajiit and Marmer rose up and fought their way to Uldor's temple, fighting the corpses he now raised to fight them. But they managed to reach the Mad Sorcerer and eventually kill his body. Unfortunately for them, just before his own living body was killed, Uldor apparently separated his body and spirit again, and thus managed to live on as a spirit, occupying other bodies. The fight against him must have seemed hopeless, but fortunately some of his own people had an ace up their sleeve. They had brought a special kind of binding stone from Piandene and used sea elf incantations on the stone, which bound Uldor's spirit to the stone, transferring the energy his spirit had generated into water. How exactly this works? No idea, it's sea elf magic. We barely know anything about Tamrielic magic, much less so from the other continents. But this magic, while it didn't destroy his spirit, it did make his spirit harmless by seemingly siphoning off the energy generated by his spirit and then converting it into water, making his spirit powerless and turning Uldor's old temple into a practical fresh water spring. This temple would become known as the Temple of Morning Springs, and the stone which bound his spirit as the Morning Stone. That's mourning as in mourning the dead, and not mourning as in morning, as in when the sun rises. Now, this name likely came to commemorate those who were lost to Uldor's madness, and for centuries, Uldor's spirit was sealed away in the temple, his energy providing clean, fresh water for the plantations on the island. And eventually, Uldor and his evils were all but forgotten. His name lost to history, and the stone which sealed his spirit became a Khajiiti religious object, because it provided fresh water for their plantations. But, as happens to almost all sealed evils eventually, Uldor managed to escape his sealing, and not because the Marmor magic which held him in place no longer worked, no. Some High Elf scholars, wondering how the stone produced fresh energy and how it worked, they took the stone from the temple, and guess what? This freed Uldor's soul, and he immediately started raising an army of the dead in order to take his island back. You, as the player, can then help reseal him in the Elder Scrolls Online, and thus reactivate the Endless Spring, and once more make the island safe and a prosperous place for plantations, because it has so much fresh water. Now, this quest is pretty generic in the Elder Scrolls Online and didn't really pay too much mind to it, personally, until I discovered this backstory, and then I felt like Uldor's insanity story definitely deserved its own video. I mean, this guy was just completely insane. I mean, he wore corpses as clothes and even has this very own summer collection and autumn collection of corpses. Doesn't get more insane than that, and I think even Sheogorath would have been like, wow. Probably an admiration, to be honest, but hey. Anyway, that was about all I can say about Uldor, and I genuinely hope that you enjoyed this video and learned something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if you did, why not return for the next Elder Scrolls lore video, probably next week. And you know, maybe subscribe to the channel, really helps me out. Like the video, also helps me out. Now, all that remains for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon subscribers, Mr. Bernardo Binda, His Soul, Gabriel Binda, Athena Iodis, Doji, Fenrir, King Chris, Pavel T, Pentam Gwar, Volkir of Argonia, Leo Worley, and Sword of Bushido. They and all the others on screen keep this channel alive, and for that I'm eternally grateful. That said, I will see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.